Yes, I'm going to be speaking about mindfulness and how it can help with our mental health, but also our physical health as well. So I'll share my screen and see if we're good there. So good. So boosting immunity and resilience with mindfulness, because our mental health is really important. I really enjoyed both of those presentations, and I'm going to be taking a slightly different perspective on things, looking at how the mind-body relationship works. So I've got a multiple choice question for you first, all right, just to see if you can pick the answer to this one. Now, what did the Thai boys soccer team have that helped them to cope with being trapped in a cave for nearly 2 weeks? Now, I guess you remember that happened a bit over a year and a half ago. The boys were trapped down there in a dark cave, so what helped them to cope with being trapped in that cave for nearly 2 weeks? Was it 20 packets of Valium? Was it free Wi-Fi? Was it a 70-inch flat screen TV and a box set of Game of Thrones? Or was it D, a coach who was a meditation teacher? I'll just give you a moment to reflect on which one it was. Okay, it was free Wi-Fi. No, it wasn't. It was a coach who was a meditation teacher. And it was really fascinating event. I was struck, I don't know if you were, but struck with how extraordinarily calm those boys were when they got those cameras into the cave. And they found them there, and how incredibly well they coped with all of that and getting out of the cave and back to back to life. And they didn't let them speak to the press for a while, after they checked that they were all right. But when they did, those boys didn't describe how they were traumatized by the event and so on. They all described how they grew almost from boys to young men, and how they found strength in themselves they didn't know that they had, and they learned about themselves. And it did certainly come to light that the coach had practiced this for many years in his own life, and he took the boys through these practices. And they coped. The resilience of those boys was extraordinary. I dare say none of them would have thought when they went into that cave, if something like that happened, that they would have coped as well as they did. Extraordinary example, perhaps a very extreme one, and one doesn't have to go into a cave like that to learn mindfulness, but it's such a case. Now, the mind-body relationship is very, very important. Some of you might have seen the documentary, The Connection, but the mind-body relationship is not a new idea. Just to go back to the ancient Greeks and Plato, you ought not to attempt to cure the body without the soul. And soul is a translation of the word mind or psyche. For this is the great error of our day in the treatment of the human body, that physicians separate the soul from the body. And these days, we're, I think, appreciating how connected the mind and the body are. And so if you are interested, that documentary is an excellent one. It's got John Kabat-Zinn and Herbert Benson and Dean Ornish and David Spiegel and many of the people that have been in this space for many, many years, and Sarah Lazar as well. And so being mindful is a very simple thing, and we have mindful moments every day of our life, just sitting there and taking in the scene and being present, really just being where we are rather than physically being one place and mentally being somewhere else. And of course, there's one other really good reason to be mindful and in the present moment. Now, in Australia, most people know of Mick Fanning. Some of you might have known of Mick Fanning. He's a 3 times world champion surfer. And this happened a few years ago in South Africa. Now, it was a surfing final, and it's live on television, and he's waiting to choose his first wave in the water. And as he's waiting, this fin comes out of the water, and it's a fin attached to a 4-metre shark. Now, luckily, Mick Fanning lifted his leg at the last moment, and the shark got the leg strap, and it missed his leg. So it chewed through that, and then it circled around and came back at him again. And by this stage, Mick Fanning is aware, and as the shark comes at him, he tries to get his board between him and the shark, and he's punching the shark. Apparently, sharks hate being punched in the gills and the point of the nose, so just remember that if you're in the water with a 4-metre shark. But anyway, and the shark comes back at him again, the same thing, and then the jet ski gets to him. So he swims to get on the back of the jet ski and to get out of the water. And he's unscathed, and they take him into shore. And very soon after that, they take him into a press conference. And the first question was, "What happened, Mick?" And Mick Fanning said, "I just went into fight or flight." So we have a stress response, which is also known as the fight or flight response. So within a split second of perceiving this threat, there's a turbocharge button that goes off in Mick Fanning's brain. That turbocharge button is called the amygdala. And bang, the fight or flight, adrenaline and cortisol, all of these chemicals start pumping around his system. Why? Well, if your body was a car, it's like putting into turbocharge. It goes into a completely different gear. So the heart rate, the blood pressure, the cardiac contractility goes up, so the heart feels like it's literally leaping out of the chest. Now, where is all the extra blood flow going? Well, that depends on which part of the body's working the hardest for the next few minutes, and that'll probably be the big muscles like the arms and legs, so the blood floods through there. More blood going in one direction means it's going to have to come from somewhere else. So the blood drains away from the skin, so we go pale. It drains away from the gut, because digesting breakfast is not your number one priority while you're trying to get away from a 4-meter shark. Now, so all of these other changes that are happening, the blood gets thick and sticky and ready to clot, which could be a good idea in a few moments from now. And also the body's pumping out a range of chemicals called interleukins or cytokines. These chemicals are there to give a short-term burst in immunity, because you want your immune cells working really well, because if that shark takes a bite out of you, you're going to need your immune cells to start very quickly protecting you from infections and so on. So there's a short-term burst in immunity. All of these changes are not anxiety, all right? It's an activation response that is actually meant to be good for our health. And if you're lucky like Mick Fanning, this stress response, this fight or flight response, is the difference between life and death. So stress is meant to be good for our health, not bad for our health. If we're in the water with a 4-meter shark. Now, if there was an MRI scanner on the back of the jet ski that picked up Mick Fanning in a few moments from now and said, Mick, we're doing a study at Monash University. We'd like to see what happens in the brain during a shark attack. What we would notice is his brain is in a very mindful state. What I mean by that is it's relatively quiet. There's not a lot of thinking happening up there right now, but it is very, very alert. So attention areas of the brain, the sensory areas of the brain are very switched on, and the amygdala, the brain's turbocharge button, is firing off. Now, we've just come to a conclusion, or at least I have, that stress is meant to be good for our health, not bad for health. And you probably thought the opposite of that. Stress is meant to be bad for our health. So maybe there are times we activate exactly the same response, but when we don't really need it. Now, I don't know whether any of you have ever gotten anxious before a future event. You know, an interview, or you might have to give a presentation or something else. Or maybe you've gotten stressed or angry or anxious over something that's happened in the past. An argument you had with somebody, a decision you wish you hadn't made, 5 or 10 years ago. Now, in this situation with Mick Fanning in the water, you can point to the fin and say, there's the stressor. There's the trigger for the stress response. But in these other situations, before or after an event's even happened, where is the stressor? And if you consider for a moment, you'll notice that it's actually in your mind. Now, I don't know if any of you have ever been, say, stressed at 3 in the morning, awake, and not only awake, but stressed and hassled and so on. And just consider what life is throwing at you at 3 in the morning. The chances are is that it's a soft mattress, a warm blanket, a soft pillow, and a quiet room. Life can't possibly get any more comfortable than that. And yet in our mind, we could be very much in a world of pain, worrying about tomorrow, next week, next year, etc., or reliving things from the past. And if somebody did an MRI of our brain at that time, they'd notice the brain's in a very unmindful state. And what I mean by that is the brain is very distracted and very active. There are things firing off all over the place, but we're out of touch with present moment reality, and our imagination circuits in the brain are running wild and unchecked. And the amygdala is firing off, not because there's actually really a shark in the room, but because the shark is in our imagination. And when we're not mindful, it is very easy to take imagination to be real. And so the body, when we do that, will just translate that into the fight or flight response. But that is not a turbocharge of energy. We've got other names for it, like anxiety. It's an inappropriate activation of a fantastic system. and it's based on being unmindful. Now, allostatic load is a technical term given to the wear and tear that we put on our body of activating this stress response time and again when we don't really need it. So it's like a wear and tear. The sympathetic nervous system, the activation system, is firing off when we don't need it. Now, for example, you might have an interview, but you get anxious about that interview dozens or even hundreds of times before you ever get in the room. Even though you could be sitting on a comfortable chair at home or having a meal, but the mind goes there and we activate the fight or flight response. Now, that is associated with a whole range of things. So impaired immunity. So we get immune dysregulation. I'll say more about that in a moment, but our immune system does not function well when we're doing this all the time. So for example, students during exam periods of semester are more likely to come down with clinical infections than if they're exposed to the same virus in the same way in a low stress period of semester. But anyway, it accelerates the hardening of the arteries that leads to heart attacks and strokes, puts our metabolism out of kilter. It damages the bones, it damages the brain. But there's only one bit of the brain that grows, and that's the amygdala. So that's the stress center. So if we keep activating the stress response all the time, over worry and rumination, etc., then it actually gets big and it gets more reactive. And this happens for people who've got chronic stress, anxiety, and depression. It's very much associated with poor mental health. And it explains a lot to us about why people with poor mental health will often have poor physical health as well. So immune dysregulation. So during periods of high stress at work or school, for example, we get this immune dysregulation. What that means is that we get more inflammation, which we don't want, and we get less defense against coughs, colds, and infections. All right, and that's the two main ways that the immune system dysfunctions. It does things that it shouldn't be doing, like causing inflammation, and it doesn't do things that it needs to do, like protect us from viruses and cancer cells, etc. So we often get sick during periods of high stress. Now, there's a term given for the state of mind that we go into when we're not mindful. It's called default mode. So if, for example, you get home after a hard day's work and your partner is talking and you're sort of nodding in the appropriate places, then all of a sudden you realize you haven't heard a word of what they've been saying for the last 5 minutes. I don't know if that's ever happened to you, but you've been in default mode. Or maybe you're reading a book, and that book could even be a book on mindfulness, and you're halfway through a chapter and all of a sudden you realize you're not paying attention to what you're reading, you're not taking it in, because your mind is somewhere else. You're physically here, going through the motions, so we could call that automatic pilot, but the mind has tiptoed off somewhere else. And it's more often than not wandered into worry, into rumination. I've got so many things to do tomorrow, will I get through it all? What if I don't, etc. Or it goes back into the past, reliving things that have happened from the day or last week or 20 years ago. So this is all called default mode. So it's very much the distracted, inattentive, and disengaged state of mind. You could say it's the opposite of what we mean to be mindful. Now, there's a lot of default mental activity in states like stress and anxiety and depression, etc. We give it names like worry, rumination, catastrophizing, negative self-talk. But essentially, it's kind of like the imagination circuits running wild. And our ability to discern between imagination and reality is impaired when we're not mindful. Because if, for example, I invited you right now to imagine a tiger for me. So if you could just imagine a tiger. Now, I'm going to ask you a question. Are you afraid that that tiger you've just imagined is actually going to eat you? You're probably not. Why? Because you know it's just an imaginary tiger, and you know an imaginary tiger can't eat you. But the next time our mind is worrying over something that hasn't happened in the future or reliving something from the past, do we also realize that that is imagination? The next time we're feeling stressed at 3 in the morning, do we realize the difference between present moment reality and where our imagination is going? So this is one of the main problems with not being mindful. worrying about things that never happened. A study at Cornell University in the States, and they looked at how many imagined calamities never materialize. And so they asked them over a long period of time to write down their worries and identified which imagined misfortunes didn't actually happen. 85% of what subjects worried about never happened at all. What they found was for the 15% that did happen, 79% of subjects discovered that they could handle the difficulty better than expected. So for example, those boys stuck in a cave, they might have discovered that they could handle, if they're mindful, that situation better than they could have even dreamed. Or to look at it, 97% of what we worry about is fearful based on exaggerations and misperceptions. And of course, this leaves us very vulnerable. Default mode, almost constantly running. Now, the ancient Greek philosopher Epictetus said, "Man is not disturbed by events, but by the view he takes of them." Now, mind you, that's how they used to speak in those days, but it's the same for women as it is for men. That events are just events, but how we perceive them, how we respond to them, determines whether it's a good thing or a bad thing or a complete non-event. Now, stress perception and health. This was a study that looked at the relationship between the amount of stress that people had in their day-to-day lives and whether they had a perception that stress negatively affected their health. And they wanted to see whether experiencing challenging life events in your life, and if you had a negative perception of stress, did that increase your risk of early mortality? So what they found is 34% of adults perceived that stress negatively affected their health a lot or somewhat. That is, oh no, stress is terrible, I'm not able to deal with it, and so viewed stress in a very negative way. Because some people will perceive stress in quite a positive way. That is, yes, I like being challenged because that's when I learn. That's what draws out my strengths. That's when I really get to test myself and rise to the occasion. So some people perceive stress in a very positive way. Those who reported a lot of stress and that stress negatively impacts their health had a 43% increased risk of premature death compared to those who either didn't have a lot of stress or challenges in their life and also didn't have a negative view of stress. So our perception makes a tremendous difference to how we experience things. And looking at this particular study, multiple sclerosis, which is not very common in Singapore, but is common in a lot of countries. But I'm going to use this as an example of seeing how it can affect our immunity. So positive stressful events. So events where a person was challenged, but perceived that challenge in a very positive way. The odds ratio for having new MS or relapses of their multiple sclerosis were nearly halved. So that is, and less risk for new lesions in their brain to cause illness. So people had a positive perception of stress. They actually had less relapses even during periods of high challenge. Those who had a very negative view of stress, then what they found was the odds ratio 1.77. That is getting close to getting new relapses and bigger brain lesions. So their disease was traveling in a very negative direction. So I put this up to give a sense of how important perception is. And of course, well, what can we do about it from a mindfulness perspective? So people talk a lot about mindfulness these days, and Time magazine have done major features on it, and it's become very popular to talk about it these days, but it is certainly not a new idea. This is a quote from William James, who very much laid the foundations for modern psychology with this classic textbook in 1890. And this is what he wrote back then. The faculty of voluntarily bringing back a wandering attention over and over again is the very root of judgment, character, and will. No one is compos sui, and that's Latin for a master of themselves. So no one's a master of themselves if he have it not. An education which should improve this faculty would be the education par excellence. That is the best of all educations. But of course, how to train attention wasn't widely known about or used in those days. So it was a footnote and ignored for about the next century. So mindfulness involves training attention and attitude. Now, the attention has got three main aspects. Firstly, to know where our attention is. So, for example, we wander into worry and rumination. If we're not mindful, we've done it and we don't even realize that we've done it. If we're more mindful, the mind might wander into worry and rumination, but we're all of a sudden able to observe that that's where our attention has gone. The second thing is to prioritize where the attention needs to be. And so we might, if we're mindful, make a choice, well, I could give my attention to worrying and negative self-talk, for example, or I could give my attention back to the person I'm with, or to the food that I'm eating, or to the car that I'm driving. So bringing attention back to what's actually happening in present moment. And then for the attention to go there and stay there, unless a more important priority comes along. Now, the mindful attitude includes things like equanimity, the ability to have some stability amidst changing circumstances, or openness to the present moment. Whether we like it or not, the present moment is what it is. So more mindful people are more open to the fact that present moment is what it is and are able to engage with it. To be curious, because of course we learn through curiosity and so on. To be accepting, even of the uncomfortable feelings and thoughts, etc. And to be more self-compassionate, rather than getting very angry with ourselves and critical with ourselves and so on. So it's this kind of gentleness of attitude that we cultivate in mindfulness as well. The number of studies published on mindfulness in peer-reviewed scientific journals, there's a graph. I think you can notice a little bit of growth there. When the studies on mindfulness to help prevent the relapse of depression started to come out around the year 2000, people started to take mindfulness seriously. So the use of MBCT, or mindfulness-based cognitive therapy, when those studies started coming out, people really started to take it seriously. And it's gone up exponentially since then. Now, the three areas of the brain that are really important in terms of development, human behavior, etc. So there's the prefrontal cortex, which is sometimes called the executive functioning area of the brain. So if you said which area of the brain does our better judgment, our discernment, our ability to be reasonable, with which area of the brain are we wise? Which area of the brain does that work through? You'd say it's this area of the brain. And then you've got the emotion system and the appetite or reward system. Now, I'm not going to go into this in great detail, but just to say that the number one executive or higher function is attention regulation, our ability to engage and sustain attention. It's another way of saying mindfulness, to be able to focus, to be present, to be on task, because all of the other executive functions very much depend on it. Our memory circuits are offline if our attention circuits are offline. Our ability to be aware of ourselves, physical and mental state, is offline if our attention's offline. Decision-making, ability to manage emotions, all of these things really depend on the awareness coming in first. Studies looking at mindfulness in the brain show that mindfulness stimulates new cell growth and new connections in executive functioning areas of the brain associated with controlling attention, ability to regulate emotions, process sensory input, memory. But the area of the brain that shrinks again is the amygdala. So that area of the brain starts to quieten down. So, and this of course is very important from an allostatic load point of view. So mindfulness seems to help reduce this physiological wear and tear on our body, remembering that one of the key elements of that is immune dysregulation, more inflammation and less defense against coughs, colds and infections. And so here are some studies in this study. They're looking at awareness-based compassion meditation. And what they found was when they compared it to a control group, the group that had the awareness-based, or mindfulness-based, if you like, compassion training, the amygdala started to quieten down. The right amygdala is a particularly important one in this particular response. And what they found also, there was the people who went through the training but did more practice, they had big reductions in the activity of the stress center of the brain. And what they found was that this reduced stress carried over not just during meditation, but in the rest of their day-to-day life. So they were much less reactive and stress prone for the other 23 and a half hours a day, depending on how long a person was practicing meditation for. Anticipation and stress. This is an interesting study, and it looked whether it got a whole group of women, they're actually female teachers in this study, who had a tendency to produce a lot of cortisol, a lot of stress chemicals when they were put under pressure. And so they got this group of women, and half of them, they gave training in how to manage those emotions and how to stay present, essentially mindfulness skills. The other half, they didn't give that training to. And then they put them through stressful situations 3 times over a period of a few months. And then they saw what happened to the 2 groups. So these were female teachers, as I said, so they taught them to stay present, pay attention to where you are, and how to feel comfortable even with uncomfortable emotions. You know, so if there's stress, rather than fighting with it, learning to feel okay with just having a stress response if it arose. So being less reactive to it. And so they stressed them 3 times, you know, getting them to prepare a speech and perform, you know, arithmetic tasks, but under very critical evaluators' eyes. What they found was that the control participants, so those who didn't have the training in mindfulness, they found every time they put them through the stressor, they had even more cortisol, more stress chemicals than the time before. Whereas the group that had this training, every time they had this tendency to have less and less stress chemicals every time they were put in that situation. So they're more comfortable, felt like they could ride their way through that situation better, and they didn't spend so much time anticipating this event coming up and how bad it's going to be. They were more able to stay present and meet the situation when it arose. The downregulation of the stress response happens even on a genetic level. So this is a study from Herbert Benson at Harvard University. And what they found was the very first time a person learns a technique like mindfulness that elicits the relaxation response, they found that the genes, the segments of chromosomes that regulate the stress response, quieten down. So regulating the stress response is actually happening at the level of the DNA of the cells, not just at the brain, not just the muscles, not just the adrenal glands. It's happening down at the level of the DNA of the cells. And of course, a person has to practice it regularly for this to actually be a long-lasting effect. Studies on depression, I won't say too much about it, but of course, this is looking at mindfulness-based cognitive therapy. This is one of many dozens of studies. And they had 106 people in this study who'd had multiple episodes of depression before. And they put them in 2 groups. One group got treatment as usual, that is essentially antidepressants. The other group got treatment as usual, but they also got MBCT. And then they looked at who did or didn't get relapses into their depression in the following 12 months. Now, the red line is the mindfulness group. So over the following 12 months, only a small proportion relapsed into depression if they had mindfulness training. The blue line is treatment as usual. So by the next 12 months, more than half had their next episode of depression, which is the expected prognosis with standard treatments. Now, the mindful group, it didn't mean they never had any negative thoughts. It just meant that they developed an ability to be able to choose to engage with the thoughts or leave them alone, an ability to stay present, an ability to learn to be self-compassionate to themselves, even when the thoughts or feelings are things they're finding uncomfortable, to be gentler in their response. These are very significant differences, of course. Default network, so that area of the brain associated with worry and rumination that's very active in things like depression and anxiety and poor mental health generally. What mindfulness does is it switches off the default circuit, so the brain becomes quiet again as soon as a person's attention comes back to the present moment through the senses, being mindful. But what they noticed was, over time, areas of the brain associated with self-monitoring and cognitive control switch on much more quickly. So as a person practices it over time, the person gets better at noticing, there's worry again, or there's rumination again. So self-monitoring, cognitive control. Is that really where I want my attention to be right now? No, just unhook the attention from that and just come back to what we're doing. So people develop that internal awareness and ability to choose. Now, Robert Ada and Nicholas Cohen, they're the two scientists who coined the term psychoneuroimmunology. Psycho, the mind, through the nervous system, talks to the immune system. And so that our brain is talking to the immune system all the time. And our immune cells, our white blood cells, talk to the brain. And until their work in the 1970s, it wasn't even known that the central nervous system, what goes on in your brain and your mind, of course, you know, that has an effect on the activity of your brain, actually talks to these immune cells and influences how we cope from an immune point of view. So P&I, or psychoneuroimmunology, the clinical relevance. So poor mental health, social isolation can lead significantly to immune dysregulation. So for example, our immune markers, our immune cells, and particularly the immunoglobulins, which are a frontline defense against respiratory infections, the poor function of immune cells, so our white blood cells, like an army that's not functioning very well, increased susceptibility to infections. If we get an infection, it's likely to be more severe. Relapse of chronic or latent infections, so everything from cold sores to chicken pox to and so on, and to HIV/AIDS, much poorer outcomes and more relapses for those with poor mental health. And poor response to immunization and impaired immune response to cancer as well, but increased inflammation. So inflammatory conditions, arthritis, dermatitis, etc., and autoimmune conditions, and increased activity of allergic conditions as well. So a lot of clinical relevance. I'll give you some examples of some studies that have looked at this. So individuals with very significant reactions to stress have the biggest disturbance to immunity when, and susceptibility to infections. So if you look at different people, those who get very reactive, a lot of cortisol, big spike in blood pressure and adrenaline and so on, they're the people that are likely, when put in stressful situations, their immune system will crash and burn, leaving them very susceptible to infections. Stress reactivity in the cold. Other studies, when this really started to take off in the late 90s, early 2000s, again, you can measure a person's sympathetic nervous system reactivity to stress and the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis. So that's essentially the pathways, how the stress response works its way through the body. What they found was high cortisol reactors with high levels of stressful life events, greater incidence of respiratory tract infections than did people who either had high reactors but they weren't put under life stresses, or people who tended to not get very reactive to stress. And for them, it didn't matter whether they were put in stressful situations or not, their immune system remained very well regulated. So mindfulness and immunity. So they've, in this particular study, 8-week training in mindfulness, and what they found was when they looked at vaccination with flu virus, and it'd be very interesting to see a similar kind of study done when there's a COVID-19 vaccine ready. What they found was that the group had mindfulness training, much stronger response in terms of antibody response to the influenza vaccine. So, and there's been other studies on hepatitis and so on. So much better response to vaccination for the group that had mindfulness training. And we know that the areas of the brain associated with mood regulation as well were changing significantly for the mindfulness group also. Randomized controlled trial here, mindfulness training compared to relaxation training, and reduces interleukin, which is one of the key stress mediators, one of those mediators of the stress response from an immune point of view. So, and they're looking in this situation at unemployed adults. And so these adults were having significant life stress, exposed to either 3-day mindfulness retreat or an active control, sort of a relaxation retreat without mindfulness. And the group that had mindfulness training not only did their brain function a lot better in terms of managing stress and so on, but they had significant reductions in these immune dysregulating inflammatory chemicals. Social environment, so adverse social experiences, that is social isolation or perceived social threat, significantly more inflammation and reduced antiviral immunity. Those who feel that they're in a very positive social environment, so that is more social connection or feel safe in your social environment, reduced inflammation, much better antiviral response. So our social and emotional situation, of course, is being very challenged at the moment, especially if people aren't feeling safe and connected to others. Looking at cancer patients, and cancer and inflammation, not a good combination. I just want to emphasize the point again, significant reductions in inflammation, but significant boosts in natural killer cell or immune cell activity as well. Mindfulness and immunity, again, looking at all of these markers. I don't want to, hammer the point, but just saying the same thing, perhaps in many different ways. But the studies continue to show, although there's always more research to be done, better immunity, less inflammation, and this is a re-regulation of the immune system. And of course, if we're trying to defend ourselves from COVID-19, these are very useful changes. And this study looked at acute respiratory illnesses, and it looked at physical exercise, but also mindfulness, 8-week mindfulness program. What they found was the mindfulness group had significantly less acute respiratory illnesses. If they got an illness, the mindfulness group, far less severe symptoms, far less severe symptoms, and about a quarter of the number of days off work compared to the control group that didn't get mindfulness training. So not only less infections, but far less severe, and about a quarter of the number of days sick. Meditation, inflammation, again, just doing some training over a few days. And as people get more experience, there's more and more of a reduction of the inflammation response. Compassion and inflammation as well. And here looking at compassion training, 6 weeks of compassion training. And of course, compassion is one of the essential elements of mindfulness. And they looked at how they responded to stress. And they found that the group that had the compassion meditation training, significantly less distress, but also less inflammation as well. So a very important emotional state to be able to cultivate. Anger and hostility certainly does not have this kind of an effect. It has the opposite effect. This is just an interesting study looking at all the genes that regulate the stress response and looking at meditation training and on the genetic level, switching down inflammation, but switching on healthy immunity. I'm just a little bit aware it's about time for me to finish. So other studies on genes, I'll just mention this last study very quickly in passing. And they were looking at a person's disposition towards happiness and how regulated or dysregulated their immune system was. And people with a hedonic disposition, that is, happiness is all about pleasure and avoid discomfort, their immune systems were regulated away from healthy immunity. So less defense, but more inflammation. Whereas the group whose disposition towards happiness was eudaimonic, and what that means is happiness as meaning, doing things in your life that are meaningful, that are purposeful, that make a contribution to others. Whether or not it's comfortable or not, it's not always comfortable, but put meaning first in their life. Then their immune system was regulated towards healthy immunity, away from inflammation and more positive response and defense against cancer. So if you'd like to learn more about mindfulness, there's a free online mindfulness course that you can do as well. It's a Monash University course, and it's going live again on October 5. So it's totally free to do that course. But that's where you can perhaps learn more about mindfulness and how to apply it. So thank you once again. I hope it's been informative.